Hi everyone, in this video I'm building a beginner-friendly plywood tower case. I tried to limit the number of power tools I used to keep it accessible to a wider audience if you want to try this yourself. The case will be a mid-tower, but at the upper end of the scale in terms of size, as you can see by the dimensions. It was way too big for the components I used, but it made it easier for me to fit everything inside. So what I'm saying is don't necessarily use these dimensions unless you really need the space. You will probably be better off making a smaller size case. I'll save you a Google and show the average sizes for PC cases. Yeah, I know I said this is a low power tool build and now I'm using a table saw, but these are all straight cuts and I'm doing it to save time. You can use anything that can cut in a straight line, or even better, ask the shop where you buy it to cut it for you. If you don't have a table saw, you can use a circular saw with a guide, a jigsaw. You can even do it by hand and clean up the edges with sandpaper. It's basically just a box, so we only need 6 pieces with opposite matching sides. Up until this point, everything went smoothly. But in case you were not paying attention, I'm not a professional woodworker, just a guy mucking around in his garage. There will be a few screw-ups and lessons learned during this build. Hopefully it will help you avoid the same mistakes when you build a case. Usually I would use a drill press to drill holes for the fans with a hole saw, but plywood is soft enough that you can do it with a hand drill. Just be careful and hold it firmly and start off slowly. I drilled from both sides to avoid tear out, but it leaves this bit in the middle you have to clean up afterwards. I would usually use a spindle sander to clean out the fan holes, but in the spirit of keeping it accessible, I tried out this drum sander drill kit. It was pretty cheap. It worked well, but I think I kept it in a single place too long, or I had the drill speed too high since it left some dents in the fan holes, but it's not that visible in the end. You can of course do it by hand, it just takes longer. You have a few options to attach the fans. You can screw them in from the inside using wood screws, but I'm not sure how many times you'll be able to unscrew them and screw them back before the hole wears out, since plywood is so brittle in the inside. You can also use threaded inserts, which is probably the best solution but not the easiest. I decided to screw in the fans from the front so the screws will be visible. It is the easiest method that will still allow you to remove the fans multiple times without any problems. This does mean the screws will be visible on the front of the case, but I decided to make it part of the case design by using a contrasting color for the screws, as you will see later. To hide the plywood edges, I'm using 12mm quad trim to match the thickness of the plywood. This way the case will have a round over without the need for a router. I thought mitered edges would be a good idea, since it would hide all the joints when you look directly at the case from the side, but they turned out to be way more challenging than I imagined. If I had to choose again, I think I would rather do butt joints. You won't see the joint from the front of the case, and from the side there will be a joint visible anyway for the side panels, and they will line up if you use the same thickness material, so you won't even notice it very much. If both options seem too difficult for you, you can leave the edges exposed. It didn't look that bad for the fan holes, but I'm not sure how it would look if it's along the whole edge of the case. The other downside of not having the trim is you won't have a round over on the front panel, and that looks strange to me having the sharp edge in the front, based on the other cases I built. As you can see, I struggled a bit to glue the quad round edges and ended up using tape. But the pieces did move around a bit and they were not pulled tightly against the bottom of the panel, so the miters were not the greatest. Handling and cutting these small quads was also a hassle. I 3D printed this mini miter box, which is an extra step and requires a 3D printer, or you can make some out of scrap wood, which is another reason I would avoid miter edges if I do this again. I took the measurements for the back of the case from my current PC. But I didn't keep in mind my current case is inverted, meaning the motherboard is mounted on the left side of the case if you're looking from the front instead of the right hand side. So this one I'm busy with now is still the wrong way around, but I'm just showing it so you can get an idea of how to do it yourself using a coping saw and files. Now I finally had a reason to try out this mortise drill attachment. Completely optional, you don't need this. In fact, I didn't use it on the back side. I eventually used for this case. But come on, it's always fun playing with a new tool. And it did make nice clean corners. Sadly, it doesn't fit my drill press, and it is a bit fiddly using it in a hand drill. It took a very long time to get a relatively crisp edge with the file, plus you are limited by the number of slots and their location. I think taking out the back side of an old case and modding it into a case like this might be easier and more flexible in terms of expansion slots. I actually only realized the back was inverted when I was about to glue it in place, so I made a new one off camera to try and save some time. I tried using an oscillating tool to see if it's quicker, but I wouldn't recommend it for accurate work like this. Even when I used a piece of wood as a guide, it was still not following the line very well. I ran out of quad edge, so I had to remove the ones from the wrong back panel. I usually buy a little bit of extra stock when I do a project, but in this case, I used to roll up trying to get the miters perfect. I used this old e-waste motherboard to mark the location of the mounting screws on the case. Pay attention to the location of the PCI slots in this picture. It's a screw up in the making, as you'll see later. Usually I would use threaded inserts, but to keep things simple, I screwed the motherboard standoffs directly into the plywood and used some CA glue to make sure they don't come loose. It felt extremely sturdy to me, and I didn't have any problem screwing the motherboard in and removing it later on. You have some choices to make when it comes to the front I/O. If you want to keep it very simple, you can add just a power button. But I wanted to make it fully functional, so I decided to add USB and front audio and a hard drive indicator light. I couldn't find an easy way to transfer the dimensions from the I/O panel to the case. I tried tracing with a pencil, but in the end I just measured it with a ruler and manually reproduced it on the case. And it came out pretty well, just the filing took forever. Now I could finally continue with the assembly. I thought it would be best to add some metal brackets since the sides are not glued to each other but to the quad edge, and I wasn't sure how strong that glue bond would be. You'll have a small bit of trim going over the edge, but you don't need a router to round it over. You can do it with sandpaper since the trim is soft enough, it doesn't take very long. I filled up the gaps with wood putty and sanded it by hand. Just in case you didn't know already, the veneer layer on plywood is razor thin, so be very careful when you sand it, as you can easily sand through or make the veneer so thin the layer underneath or the glue starts showing. To give the side panel a place to screw into, I'm making supports out of plywood. But in retrospect, I should have used some hardwood since the plywood is a bit brittle in small pieces. So I had to go on a side quest to make some assembly squares to hold the clamps in place. One thing I did notice from the other cases I built, and this is expected since wood behaves this way, the side panels, because they are so thin, can cup over time and you'll get gaps between the case and the side panel. To prevent that, I'm also adding supports in the middle of each side of the case, so in total there will be 8 screws holding down the side panel. This is also where I realized I made a mistake with my design. When I tried to fit the side panels, I had huge gaps. I think I should have glued the quad edges to the side panel, except for the front one. That should be glued to the front panel. I was trying to avoid seeing a seam at the top of the case, but it actually looks worse now with the seam around the side panel, and it is more difficult to remove the panel. If I did it this way, I could also use the side panel with the quad edges glued on as a reference during the assembly glue up. I countersunk the holes for the fans just to keep it neat, but this step is optional, especially if you use pan head screws instead of countersunk ones. you won't have to do the countersinking. Since plywood is soft, I thought it better to add polyurethane instead of paste wax like I usually do for the finish. You have to give it a few layers and a gentle sanding between each layer, and probably start with a slightly diluted penetrating layer since the plywood will absorb the varnish quite a bit. It did in my case anyway. To keep things simple, you can buy fan mesh covers. I just made my own since I need them so often. It is cheaper to buy a roll instead of individual pieces. Here's another gotcha. The motherboard I used as the source for the slot locations on the back of the case turned out to be different to the one I ended up installing, because it had a one-lane PCI slot between the CPU and the slot usually used for the GPU. Now I did notice this difference earlier between an M80X and 80X motherboard I had, but I thought it was due to the different form factors. But as you can see, both motherboards in this case are M80X, but the slots are different. So in the end, I had to use this smaller GPU to test the PC instead of the dual slot Nvidia 1080 I wanted to use. I also ran into a small problem with the fans. The description on Amazon did say the fans are daisy chain capable, but it didn't mention the fans can only be used in a daisy chain. You can't use them individually because they have proprietary connectors, so just watch out for that if you ever buy fans. Overall, the case came out pretty well, based on the choices made to keep it simple and to limit the power tools used, and it is fully functional. There are a few small things to call out. On the long edges, there's a bit of movement in the plywood. I use 12mm plywood, but for this size case, I think something closer to 18mm would be better. Depending on how wide you make the case, consider using 140mm fans instead of 120mm ones. It worked fine, but the 120mm fans had a bit too much space on the sides. It looked slightly off to me. Now this is a new channel and I'm still working out the format of the videos. It feels to me like there are like 1,000 small steps to building a PC case, and for now I'm trying to explain them as I go along instead of playing music. But let me know in the comments what you think about the format and length, since I used fast forward quite a bit and I try to keep the video a reasonable length. Thank you for watching, see you next time.